Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's try to start our session. Welcome to this second day of our TESS annual conference on trade, climate and sustainable development. Really happy to see you here this morning. What we're planning to do this morning is, the session in front of us is really trying to look at the opportunities and pathways for cooperation on trade, with a particular focus on not only COP30, but I would say more broadly in the context of the UNFCCC. And we all know that discussions around trade have gained a bit of momentum in the climate talks, and the idea this morning is really to try to explore which are some of the pathways and perspectives and some of the initiatives that are emerging in this area. And for this, we're very fortunate to have a brilliant panel of experts who have been working on these issues for quite some time. The idea is to just have short introductory remarks, and then hopefully we'll have time for interaction. So we'll ask our speakers to roughly stick to their 6 minutes. I think Erika gets some special and differential treatment as as the president of the having the presidency of the COP, CBDR. So you'll get 8 minutes. But the idea is that first to listen to her, and then have a broader discussion with our panel. I'm not going to introduce the speakers. I think you have their bios on the website. So I think really in the interest of time, we'll move directly to their introductory remarks, and I will start with Erika Watanabe Patriota, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative at the Permanent Mission of Brazil to the WTO. Then we'll move to our other colleagues, starting with Chantal Carpentier, who's the Head of Trade, Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at UN Trade and Development. We have Vicente Yu from University of Philippines College of Law. Andrei Marcu, on my left, Executive Director of the Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. We will have online Christina Voigt, who is the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. And finally, last but not least, my colleague Yasmin Ismail, who is a senior policy advisor at TESS. So that's a little bit the plan for today. So let's start with you, Erika.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and congratulations on organizing this first TESS annual conference. I think it's very important for us to get together in such configuration. So climate action at the necessary scale means rewiring how the global economy produces, consumes, and values things. Trade is a structural piece of this transition. It determines what moves where, what generates returns and attracts investment, what achieves competitive scale, what becomes stranded. With just over 2 weeks before Belém, the question confronting COP30 is how to reconcile trade and climate architectures. Our time is short, and at this critical 5-year window, developing countries are facing finance bottlenecks, and their producers lack resources for the transition. Eradicating poverty, the greatest global challenge as recognized by Agenda 2030, is facing setbacks that impacts climate change will only make worse. Trade mobilizes, transfers, and allocates resources. But the distributional effects of integrating climate considerations into trade are anything but neutral. Who captures value from the low-carbon transition? Who bears the costs? How do we design market signals that incentivize decarbonization without locking in structural asymmetries? Can trade accelerate climate action and ambition without leaving behind those least responsible for this crisis? These questions explain why trade has become contentious in climate negotiations. Since COP28, a group of parties has pressed for a formal UNFCCC agenda item on unilateral trade restrictive measures at every conference. Two camps have formed since 2023. One argues that trade must be examined systematically within the UNFCCC to prevent it from becoming a vector for inequity, through which transition costs are externalized onto developing countries through measures that look neutral on paper but are discriminatory in practice. Another group contends this framing risks constraining the ambition the climate crisis demands. They argue that trade is a powerful mechanism for rewarding early movers, creating competitive pressure towards higher ambition, and enabling their national decarbonization strategies. In Bonn, this year, parties agreed that issues related to unilateral measures would be discussed on the relevant agenda items. Additionally, work continues under the Responsive Measures track, where the current program features an activity focused on assessing the cross-border impacts of measures related to trade. Beyond those items, parties have requested an agenda item specifically on trade-restrictive unilateral measures for COP30. As the incoming presidency, Brazil's role is not to choose sides. We have been listening to parties through a series of presidential consultations with negotiating groups and individual countries, working to help delegations to find common ground. While work in the formal track continues, COP30's defining contribution may be to create the space for concrete action at the trade-climate intersection. Belém action agenda will mark a refocus of the climate regime, a shift from negotiation to implementation. The first global stocktake told us what must be done for humanity to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. The action agenda will implement it. Trade is no exception to that logic. Paragraph 54 of the global stocktake calls for cooperation toward, and I quote, an open and supportive international economic system aimed at achieving sustainable economic growth and development in all countries, and thus enabling them better to address the problems of climate change. In response, Brazil will launch the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade. The forum's value proposition is straightforward. If countries diverge on their formal political positions, we will look for solutions in concrete practice. It will be a cross-cutting dialogue, convening officials from both climate and trade areas of government. The idea that climate and trade can be discussed in silos is no longer tenable. It is fading not because anyone decided it should, but because the physics of the transition will not observe our institutional boundaries. When climate policy determines trade outcomes and trade rules shape climate effectiveness, solutions require integrated expertise. The forum will operate as a non-prejudicial, non-attributive setting, insulated from negotiation dynamics. There will be no negotiated outcomes, no political statements, no policy guidance. Its only function is providing intellectual and relational infrastructure so that countries can rediscover how to collaborate with their unlike-minded peers. From this unique structure fit for experimentation, the forum will challenge countries to sketch practical solutions that leave everyone better off. It will then put these concepts to test through its diverse membership. Ideas emerging from this process will carry no legal status. They are reference materials for countries to use and adapt as they prefer. But they will reflect something rare in international processes, the insights of a collective intelligence that reaches across the geopolitical and economic divides. The forum's distinctiveness is by design. It is different from all existing processes because it is intended to fill a gap, to support the WTO and the UNFCCC by doing what these organizations cannot do. The solutions it will surface, the trust it will build among government officials. This will be its contributions to move the needle towards collaboration in a way that negotiation cannot achieve. COP30 will advance trade and climate issues on two tracks. Trade climate issues on two tracks. In negotiations, we will work forward to a formal understanding within the UNFCCC existing architecture. Through the action agenda, we will transcend negotiations and find mutually empowering, progressive solutions that address climate change by making our economies stronger and fairer. The Integrated Forum will launch at the Berlin Climate Summit with an invitation for all countries to join us. Let us show that even in an age of fracture, collective problem solving remains possible when we design the right space for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erika, for this this great overview, and congratulations to Brazil for this initiative on this integrated forum on the climate and trade. I think it's a very innovative initiative. So look forward to see how it evolves. So let's move to our reflections from our other participants, and I will start with you, Chantal.
Thank you so much, Christophe, and thank you, Erika, for setting the scene. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you. Sorry I couldn't join yesterday. As you know, UNCTAD 16 is ongoing. I'm happy that as of 12:15 last night, or this morning rather, we have an outcome document that should, and we had a concluding session yesterday, so I'm very happy about that. And it does have a mandate to continue working on trade and climate and the triple planetary crisis at UNCTAD, which we believe is very important, and this is something that we look forward to do. I also want to mention, for those of you that didn't follow, that the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, was here on Wednesday. Was it Wednesday? Yeah. And he mentioned 4 areas that UNCTAD should work on. And the 4th one, and I'm going to read it because I think it's important, is we need to align trade policies with our climate objective and ensure that trade support ambitious climate action and a just transition. This means integrating trade strategies into countries' new national climate plan, which are due ahead of UN COP in Brazil in the next month. So that's very important because this is clear mandate from the highest level at the UN. And we have a few paras in, operational paras in the outcome document for the work that UN UNCTAD is going to do for the next 4 years. In terms of going straight to the COP then, and maybe that I feel a little comfortable to talk about the action agenda, but I will have to talk about it because we've been asked, we've worked very closely with the COP presidency, Brazil, on 3 main areas. One is, of course, on trade and climate key objective, where the Integrated Forum on Trade and Climate is one of the plan for accelerated solution. The second one is one that we submitted at UNCTAD and was selected by the presidency, which is on the second point that the Secretary General mentioned, which is using trade measures to advance not only the ambition, but the implementation of the NDCs. So basically, as we are now, as of yesterday, there was 61 to be confirmed, 62 countries that submitted the NDCs. And of course, now we're moving into implementation of these NDCs. How do we help developing countries? And we know that aid is decreasing, and trade can be a real measure to help developing countries to advance. And therefore, we've developed a guide for policymakers on using trade measure to advance NDCs. So on the one hand, we're going to work on how to, and this is a bit of building on the work that ISSD has done on the design of these measures to carbon pricing and border carbon adjustment. How do you design them to have maximized greenhouse gas impact, highly reduction, while minimizing negative spillover effect on developing countries? So that's one strand of work. And the second one is how do you use better trade, leverage trade, to actually implement these NDCs? So these will be the two angles that we're going to be using. And in these plan for accelerated action, accelerated solution that the Brazilian government is leading, these will be towards 2028 for the next stock stake. And basically, everybody is called to contribute. So right now, the plan as ICC, ITC, World Business Council on Sustainable Development, but I hope that colleagues here will join us in as we go and as we implement those action. Solution, I think the Brazilian call it the mutirão, which is to bring every stakeholder to the table to help advance those. So these will be launched at COP30. We will have official event to launch those. And we will also have, for those of you that will be there, we'll have closed door workshop within the Action Agenda Pavilion, where we will be discussing how together we're gonna work to implement and advance these solutions. The second area that we're working on, because I was talking with with a colleague here, if we're going to do that, maximizing greenhouse impact, reduce negative spillover, and use trade, we're going to have to go sectoral. We're going to have to go into these level. So two areas that we're going to focus, there's three areas of importance to developing countries. We all know they're agriculture, fisheries, tourism. And basically, one of them is on fisheries and seaweed. So we have a plan for accelerated action, a solution on fisheries and seaweed with the Ministry of Fisheries of Brazil. And the second one, of course, is everything that has to do with forestry, tourism, and this is the bioeconomy. So the bioeconomy section, I believe, branch of the Environmental Ministry of Brazil as a bioeconomy challenge, and it has it has four working groups. One is on metrics, that will be led by FAO. The second is on financing, which will be led by the IADB. The third one is on market development and trade, which will be led by UNCTAD. And the fourth one is on social bioeconomy, which is really what means community-based agriculture, community-based forestry, these more social impact. And the last one is procurement. Finally, procurement is back. I remember when I worked for the NAFTA CEC, we work on greening trade in North America through procurement. This is back on the agenda, so this is the third area I'm going to work on. So I think we have, there's going to be a negotiation side, and I want to thank Brazil because at the last COP meeting, the last UNFCCC meeting, they called for UNCTAD to get more involved into the UNFCCC. We hope we stand ready to do that with our partners, but also the non-negotiated agenda is also very important to get the action going. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Brilliant, excellent, and congratulations on your outcome documents, and great to see all these initiatives on trade in the context of the COP. Next is Vice.
Thank you, and thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be here. My official title on our program is a professor at the University of the Philippines College of Law, but I do wear several hats. One of those hats is as like Andre over there on the other side of the table, one of those worker bees deep in the dungeons of the UNFCCC negotiations, working away and trying to come up with text. Andre is one of the primary architects, for example, for Article 6. And thank you, Ambassador Erica, for the update on where we are with respect to the trade and climate discussion. What I wanted to focus on, at least in my short presentation here, is that it seems to me that if you look at where we were, for example, in this conversation on trade and climate, say before the pandemic, right? Say in 2019, and where we are now, I think things have moved very far, very fast. What we have now is an emerging ecosystem of organizations and initiatives that are working on different aspects of the issue in a much more focused and I think targeted and deliberate manner. There were there was work being undertaken on this over the past 20 years, of course. Aaron is here and he knows what I'm talking about, right? But the issue in terms of the political relevance of it seems to have come up very high on the screen, at least in the past 5 or so years. And that's partly for two reasons. One, I think, as Ambassador Erica was saying, you have this focus now by developing countries to keep raising the issue of unilateral measures in relation to climate and environment being raised in different fora. You're seeing it being raised in the WTO. You saw it raised in Seville in the FFD4 conference in July. You saw it being raised big time here in UNCTAD 16. And you saw it, as Ambassador Erica was saying, being raised not for the first time, but for the first time in a broadly strategic and coordinated manner back in 2022 and 2023. When the G77 said, we want to see an agenda item on this issue to be discussed. And I was there in the global stocktake negotiations when we were pushing it as G77, and that's why you have paragraph 154 of the GST outcome there that talks about the unilateral measures issue. And you're also seeing it again and again over the past few years now, since 2023, being raised as an agenda item, including for COP30. A group of developing countries took up the cudgels from where Brazil originally suggested it in 2023, and then China in 2024, and now a group of developing countries that includes India, for example, and Saudi Arabia this year in 2025, for an explicit agenda item, unilateral measures, and focusing in particular, for example, on CBAMs and the EU. Now, the political pressure here is because developing countries are responding this way because they have been seeing or perceiving an increased willingness by developed countries to in fact use unilateral measures compared to how it was in the past. So this is action-reaction, like Marxist thought of dialectics, thesis, antithesis. And so you're seeing this now. And I think organizations are starting to respond to that kind of thesis, that kind of dialectics as well. So you're seeing it in WTO, you saw it in the TCSD, the organizations and initiatives like this forums coming here. And you've got the initiative that the COP30 presidency is going to be launching as well. So I think to conclude, what we are seeing is this emerging ecosystem. The challenge for us as a community of thought and a community of practice that has tried to work on this issue is the integration aspect of it. My colleagues and I working in the climate change area know a little bit of trade. Our colleagues working in the trade area know a little bit of climate, or maybe not even a little bit sometimes. And the challenge is how to bring that together. And we have been trying. I know that Test Forum has been trying to do that, but it's still that making that connection between, for example, the trade and climate and environment ministries that is so challenging, how to break the silos. And maybe UNCTAD's work can help us with that, right? At the same time, we need to make sure that in the UNFCCC side, the climate folks know that the other parts of the system are listening to them, right? Which is why I think one of those things that need to be done, and which is what I think the idea of this agenda item being proposed by some developing countries is to precisely push that issue forward, not only at the technical level. For example, in the Katowice Committee on the impact of response measures that Andre has been working on, but also at the political level, because this needs to be flagged as a political issue in the climate context, so that, again, you can break the silos and it can have this broader conversation on how to integrate things in a way that then supports the global public good objectives of climate and, climate and trade and development together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vice. That's really interesting to understand a little bit the history and the dynamics of this discussion. Next on my list is you, Andre.
It's me. As the song goes, where do I begin? I mean, I'm giving, 6 minutes to give us
Yes.
to do this, and this is the story of a lifetime story. Look, I have two sides to my mind. One side is I run a think tank in Brussels. As such, I've got a European perspective on things. The second side of it, I negotiate response measure for developing countries. Now, the two are very difficult to reconcile sometimes, and I'll tell you very clearly from the very beginning, from a European mindset, I think border carbon adjustment, CBAM, is a necessary condition. From a developing country point of view, I don't think it's aligned with the spirit and letter of the Paris Agreement. End of story. How do you reconcile these two? I'm not quite sure, but when I wake up at night, I try to do that. Now, I did share response measures under UNFCCC, both for the work program that ends up this year and the work program that was negotiated in Baku and starts next year, which are slightly different. But if you talk about the UNFCCC process, you all know that it's trade is mentioned in the Framework Convention, in the Kyoto Protocol, in Article 415 of the Paris Agreement. It's there. Now, if you want to talk about trade at a COP, it really depends what you want to do. Do you want to talk about it because you want to talk about it, highlight an issue, or do you want to have remedial measures? Remedial measures on trade are not in the UNFCCC. I mean, we all know that, and anybody who thinks they can do that is probably unrealistic. But the one thing that one should think about in the UNFCCC is when it comes to what is called loosely response measure, unilateral trade measures, you can look at them and see if they're aligned with the Paris Agreement. If people put in place measures, you have to think whether they're aligned with the Paris Agreement. For instance, you want to look at a CBAM. Is the CBAM aligned with the Paris Agreement? Is it respected or common by differentiated? It is respecting the principle of NDCs. Nationally determined, by definition, nationally determined. If we impose a tax on somebody who doesn't do the same thing as you impose a €100 tax. Is that the Paris Agreement? So that's what you can do in there. Now, if you want to, there was a mention as to why this is becoming important. Look, I used to work in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I actually lived here in Geneva for 10 years. It's changed quite a lot, I have to say that. But I remember talking to Bjorn Stigson, and at that time, Bjorn said, listen, these guys are old friends in Rio with Schmidheine and Maurice Strong and all these people, but now they're going to get at each other's throats because this is about competitiveness. I mean, this may be an environmental treaty, but this is an economic treaty. This is all about the implementation, all about competitiveness. And this is why the Brussels agenda, which was supposed to be about implementation, has become about competitiveness. Now, going back to really where this discussion takes place at the COP, initially and for a long time, they were in response measures. I frankly didn't quite understand what it. I come from carbon trading and Article 6, as you said. And one day I walked into this room where people are arguing very, very ugly, because there is a difference. When you go into the Article 6 room, people are arguing, but they're very friendly with each other, like a big family. When you go into the response measure room, it's ugly. I mean, people call themselves each other names, and it gets really, I'm serious, gets really, I chaired that meeting for many years, and it's not a nice thing. Now, where is it? It's in response measure, but now it's also popped up in just transition. And for a long time, we had trouble understanding what the difference between just transition and response measure, because response measure was supposed to have two elements. One of them was just transition, the other one, economic diversification. So all of a sudden in Sharm, I think it was in Sharm el-Sheikh, suddenly popped up a very important work stream of just transition. Now, the conclusion that we reach is that the powers to be, and we will not name parties, would like to keep response measure as a technical kind of technical discussion type of stuff, what just transition becomes more of the political stuff. And in principle, there is a split within the G77 with some wanting trade measures in response measures, and some of them would not want to have them because they think it will pollute response measure, and block response measure would like to have it in just transition. Now, there's also a discussion in the GSD, which is obviously something that will be ongoing. Ambassador Watanabe Patriota has mentioned this very interesting and very good initiative that, with our modest means and influence, we are very happy to support, and we think it's an excellent initiative. But really, in the end, what are the important things that you can do? The important thing that you have to achieve if you want this is to have parties report on the impact on response measures. And if you look at it, there is one report on the impact. There's a space within the UNFCCC to do so. There's one party that has reported, predictably Saudi Arabia. They're the only party. Nobody else has done that report, and we tried to and tried, and there seems to be this discontinuity between what is being negotiated with our negotiator with a yes or no, and lately that we beginning to have people that actually understand trade in there. There's the the Brazilians, there are the Chileans, the South Africans. There's a number of people that are beginning to appear within the response measure just transition ecosystem that actually understand trade and are getting into the climate stuff. Now, I can speak for another half an hour, but I think that Christoph is probably not happy.
I'm very happy so far, so that's good. But thank you, Andre, for these insights, and we'll come back, I think, to some of these issues maybe in the discussion. Next on my list is Christina Vogt, who's joining us online. Can you hear us, Christina?
Yes, I can hear you. Is that the same for you?
Yes, please go ahead.
Very good morning from Oslo. I am very grateful for the invitation, and I'm very sorry for not being able to be with you in person, but I do enjoy this very important discussion indeed very much. And as we already heard from several panelists, trade and climate will be not such a marginal topic at COP30, but we don't quite know yet how big it will become. As was already mentioned by the ambassador, and I think by other panelists as well, trade and climate will pop up under different agenda items, but most prominently, of course, under the provisional agenda items for both the COP and the CMA, the agenda item titled Promoting International Cooperation and Addressing the Concerns with Climate-Related Trade Restrictive Unilateral Measures. Quite a title, and we will see how the adoption of the agenda will turn out on day one of the COP and the CMA. Now, I mentioned the title of the agenda item because the title suggests quite a wider nexus between trade and climate change than just CBAM and trade restrictive measures. And I will briefly address three elements that are kind of embedded in the wider nature of this agenda item. That's first, international cooperation. Second is embedded emissions in international trade. And then third, very briefly, of course, trade restrictive measures. First, on international cooperation, we do know that trade can and is a catalyst for international cooperation. And we also do know that if we want to get down to net zero and potentially net negative emissions sometime around the middle of the century, that this requires an unprecedented energy transition. It requires low carbon diversification and sustainable value chains. And in this context, of course, cooperation and trade are absolutely indispensable. We do know that trade and access to environmentally friendly goods and services will be crucial for the implementation of NDCs, of nationally determined contributions, by many parties, as well as for the fulfillment of their national adaptation plans, because most, if not all, countries depend on imports and exports of these goods and services. So much on international cooperation. Let me move on to the second aspect, and that's that trade also causes global emissions in greenhouse gases. Around 25% of global emissions are embedded in international trade. However, these emissions, as we know, from mainly international aviation and international shipping, are largely outside parties' NDCs, and they're also outside parties reporting under the Paris Agreement through their biannual transparency reports. Now, some are addressed through the ICAO, in particular CORSIA, and now also through the IMO. But we also see lately that some states have started to include embedded emissions in their climate policy, realizing that their imports drive up the emissions of other states, of their trade partners, in a way like my imports are your emissions, and that relationship starts to be reflected in some parties' climate policies. Now, this is, as we all know, not an easy topic to address, and it has a lot of sensitivities around it and a lot of reservations, but it is nevertheless an important topic. And at the very least, it might be timely to develop and set up more specific carbon accounting and traceability systems for emissions that are embedded in traded commodities. And this might help industry to track and then, of course, eventually also reduce embedded emissions in trade. We do know that there are already some disclosure policies in place, like the CSDDD in Europe, but it's not just a matter of regulation. It is also a matter of investor demand that does drive greater disclosure and decarbonization of global supply chains in order, in particular, for investors and for exporters to position themselves in a competitive, positive space, and also to avoid against stranded assets. And now my third and last point, of course, as some have already discussed it, trade restrictive measures, also linked, of course, to trade policies, where we see that states may choose to restrict either the import of particular goods or requiring the internalization of climate costs, or putting a price of carbon on those traded goods, similar to those that incur in the domestic or regional market. And of course, the prime example is the EU CBAM. Now, whether CBAM indeed is a unilateral measure or not, or whether CBAM is compatible with WTO rules or not, is a broader discussion, of course, not to be detailed here. But we do know, and it's clear, that the more across the table discussions and discourses happen, and the more countries implement ambitious climate policies domestically, the less likely is a trade conflict. And I think in this context, it is laudable that Brazil, at the COP presidency level, but also at the level of the finance ministry, is exploring several avenues. One avenue was already mentioned by Ambassador Patriota and other panelists. Of course, it's the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade, which is a very welcome space to enable the discussion. And as she said, it's insulated from the negotiation round, and very rightly so, to disengage the very heated discussions that we sometimes see in the formal negotiations from a more open space to have informed discussions. A second proposal, which wasn't mentioned yet, is that of an open coalition for carbon market integration, which aims at harmonizing standards and linking carbon markets. And I think this is a very worthwhile proposal to think about more deeply, sometimes referred to as a CBAM coalition or CBAM club, but I'm not so sure how suitable this term is. So it's meant to be a coalition of the willing and to operate with kind of shared or comparable emission caps, also potentially including a resource channeling mechanism to poorer countries. And it is indeed intended to de-escalate the imposition of a border adjustment measure or border adjustment measures. So rather, in a way, rather than fighting and opposing CBAM, the coalition would kind of work with it and establish conditions which would make the application of border adjustment measures less likely or even unlikely and unnecessary, and at the same time reducing emission and at the same time avoiding a trade conflict and prolonged discussions and negotiations. I think this almost sounds too good to be true, but we have to keep our hopes up that this is a worthwhile avenue and initiative to explore. So I think what I was trying to say is that trade is an important lever in many ways, but it remains, after all, and I think that's important to remember, it remains a tool, right? It remains a means to an end. And the end is to get emissions down to global net zero and thereafter to net negative emissions. And I think in that context, trade can be a very important catalyst. Thank you so much, and back to Geneva.
Thanks a lot, Christina, for this overview. Let me move to our last speaker, Yasmin.
The way you put it, last speaker.
But not least.
No, it's hard to be the last speaker because I've been like ticking the boxes of everything that I was going to say. But it also allows me to reflect a bit on what has been said, if you don't mind. So I have two reflections, two messages to make, and a test initiative to share with you. My first reflection is to support my colleague Weiss a bit in his rather optimistic view that we've gone so far at the nexus of trade and climate within the UNFCCC context and COP discussions. I agree that 5 to 7 years ago, going to COP to try to organize meetings around trade and climate in UNFCCC spaces, it was not easy. People would look at you as if you're ET who is coming from a different galaxy and you should run and catch your ship to go back to whatever you're coming from. However, we've seen now the progress that has been done. We have one technical space within the UNFCCC where trade is being discussed. We have the Just Transition Program. We have Brazil initiative of the IFCCT trying to organize that safe space independent from the two unilateral spaces at the nexus of trade and climate. So we're seeing more constructive discussion. And I think that this is my second message, that we've learned that to solve the issues at the nexus of trade and climate and to ensure that trade is a constructive tool, like it was just said, it's going to take a little bit of time because climate is action is a long-term objective. So we need structured discussions, we need processes and dialogues that can support, that can think over the long term and be able to generate solutions. And this is what we're starting to see. Regarding my messages, one key message that I wanted to bring to this panel and discussion is that it has become more and more obvious that sustainable development can't be an afterthought at the nexus of trade and climate. We were reminded by many participants and speakers yesterday that not only are developing countries facing disproportionate climate vulnerability, but these impacts are making them actually galvanize their efforts despite their limited capacities and resources to transform their economies and secure their place in a green future. That is, developing countries realize the importance of economic transformation for their resilience, competitiveness, and development. We need to acknowledge that this is happening in many developing countries. From an international cooperation viewpoint, it is clear that achieving the goal, the global goal of reducing emissions, is also needs to bring developing countries on board. And critically, as we have heard consistently yesterday, integrating the development dimension into the climate and trade discussion calls for a far greater attention to trade challenges that are arising from climate vulnerability, that's their context, and climate shocks to foster resilience and support their adaptation. My second message is that to align with my colleague Vice as well, and Chantaline, is that to advance cooperation on trade and climate, and to move climate action to implementation, we don't only need to connect the dots internationally between the processes and institutions, but we also need to connect the dots at home, back at the national level, particularly in the context of developing countries that face multiple climate impacts and have limited fiscal space, capacity constraints, a lot of priorities to have the trade-off between, and help them to identify the best policy tool, the best trade policy tool that they would be able to mobilize to meet those various objectives. Also for developing countries, it is important to consider where trade policies and trade cooperation can help, not only in the context of NDCs, but the national adaptation plans, their national development frameworks, their expert competitiveness strategies. They have a lot of frameworks and strategies and forward-looking sustainable development objectives that they want to achieve, and it's connecting the dots between all these and identify trade tools that can support all these priorities at the same time. That brings me to my final point, which is the initiative that TESS is working on now. And this is an area where we can also see collaboration, Chantaline, because you just mentioned that the SecGen mentioned developing trade-related or strategies around trade and climate back home. And this is what TESS is actually doing right now. We have a cooperation with the Philippine mission of the WTO and also the University of Philippines, and we're starting to support developing countries develop strategies or trade-related climate strategies for climate-resilient development. We had the first consultation in Philippines, and one thing that I want to conclude with is something that that I checked with Ambassador Tihanki, if I can, with the mission of Philippines, if I can quote Ambassador Tihanki on that. And he said something that inspired me a bit. For many developing countries, he said, in the context of Philippines, we don't need more frameworks. What we need is a vision. And this is what we are trying to help developing countries to do, and we hope to expand this work beyond Philippines in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Yasmin, I think for highlighting this need to not only connect the dots at the international level between different processes and communities, but also domestically among different ministries involved in these discussions. So that takes us to the end of our first initial remarks. Before opening the floor for questions, so think about your questions and your comments. I just wanted to give our speakers maybe an opportunity to react to what you've just heard, disagree, compliment, if you don't have to, but if you like. I see Andre and Vice and then Chantaline. Erika, you want? Okay.
Let's be short so we can have a conversation, because this is the graduate institute supposed to have informal discussions. Look, climate, and when we started all this, clearly competitiveness is going to become an issue. Clearly was going to become an issue. And the initial thought, which, I was CEO of AIDA for many years, was this dream that you'd have one global carbon price. And that would have linked system, you have one global climate price, and I think that we have Switzerland and EU linked after about 25 years. A great achievement, because it took about 10 years to negotiate, but it's not going to solve much. So, and continue to do that and go down that avenue is probably very interesting, and I will still believe in carbon markets, but it's probably not something is going to happen and in a very significant way to solve the problem. So what you see now, this discussion on trade is and border adjustment and unilateral trade, it is a plan B. It's people saying we couldn't solve that one, so we're going to solve it through this. And the question is, no matter how you put it, this is not an inducement. It's not an encouragement. CBAM is not. It sounds like a nice thing, we're giving you incentive. It's not incentive with a stick. Come on, somebody's going to penalize you $100. It's not an incentive. So I think that we need to find out how to do this, but in a cooperative way. And I think that there is within the UNFCCC a lost child. And, when we negotiate Article 6, I negotiated Article 6 in Paris, we all focus on 6.2 and 6.4 because that's the sexy part of this whole conversation. But there's an Article 6.8, which talks about international non-market cooperation. And I think that if the UNFCCC would like, instead of inventing an enormous amount of new avenues, just transition, I don't know what, all kinds of other places that we negotiate stuff, there is something in here. I know the UN likes to invent new things all the time, but there is a place where you could use, and I think that a lot of the developing countries would actually welcome that. I don't speak for them here in this forum, this is not my role, but I think I hang around enough in the community of G77, and I think that this is an instrument that could be put to better use.
Thank you. Just picking up from where Andre left off, and what the Professor Christina was pointing out. I had the privilege of working with Brazil back in 23, with China in 24, and then with this group of developing countries this year, in thinking through how do we advance this conversation on trade and climate in the UNFCCC process, because of the different hats I was wearing in the climate negotiations. And I think if one reads, for example, the proposal this year, from this group of developing countries that suggested that agenda item, there are three things that really come out, right? Professor Christina pointed to some of them already, and then Andre. One is this concern over the use of competition-oriented measures to trigger some sort of climate-related response. And that has raised a concern because many of the developing countries that have put forward this proposal view it as some kind of extraterritorial application of policy. And we need to address that. So it becomes very highly political. Second, I think the call of those in the UNFCCC that want to see this conversation being addressed, for example, in the UNFCCC process, including, for example, in the Article 6.8 framework that Andre was talking about, in the response measures and just transition, is perhaps we need to reframe, the call is to reframe the conversation away from competition into cooperation. And that's why if you look at the provisional agenda and the proposal that went into that provisional agenda, very upfront and center there is this request to say we need to talk about international cooperation as the fundamental basis for how one integrates trade and climate change, which means looking at it not from what can we do, I think Andrea's pointing to this as well, what can we do to force other countries to do something, but what can we do together with other countries so that we all lift each other up. And the backdrop for that is, I think, this sense of unfairness coming from many developing countries, where they're seeing that, it goes all the way back to 1992, for example, where you're seeing, where they feel, the perception is that environmental standards are being imposed on them which might not necessarily be appropriate for them, or in their current context or current circumstances. Second, that they are being told, and this I think particularly relevant in this current geopolitical juncture, that they are being told that others know best what they should be doing, or others know better what they should do for, you know what I mean. And so I think that those kinds of considerations are important for this conversation as well. Because otherwise we might end up with a situation where we focus too much on the technical and legal aspects of unilateral measures, for example, and then forget that behind that there is a whole universe of other considerations that go into why this particular agenda item was proposed, or why some other countries proposed this kind of measure, and how you respond to that in the UNFCCC, in UNCTAD, in WTO. And so I think the Brazilian proposal is very useful. I think it can help us advance the conversation. But at the same time, I think the call is you need to have also a clear multilateral forum that has the ability to actually come up with multilaterally agreed responses that upfronts and centers international cooperation as the trade and climate linkage, rather than front and centers competition aspects. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe I'll pick on what Andreas has mentioned is, so this idea of, what's the best way to get to where we want to get, which is the Paris Agreement, right? Is it to give reward or is it to give penalty? And I think it's pretty clear that it's true reward. One of them is to the guide that we've provided, step-by-step guide to use trade measures, and looking forward to work with you, Yasmin. One of them is how to ensure and help developing country take advantage of low carbon green export. And it goes to, the cooperation there, because, and this is what happened yesterday in our Changemaker event, so where we had climate innovator, non-plastic innovators, biodiversity provider innovators on the ground, and the ambassador of Cameroon said, what we need is these new low carbon green market needs to be a competitiveness value and not marginalization. And so I think it leads then to my third point, which is trust, which I think you were alluding to, Vince. But this idea that they will need cooperation for market access, because these markets between regulatory and voluntary environmental standard are spreading, uncoordinated, and just ballooning. Market access is becoming a real issue for developing country and won't happen without cooperation. And finally, technology, and I think, Christina, you mentioned technology, and that's another area where facilitation and cooperation is needed. One of the area in the plan that we've submitted for our solution is, instead of talking about tech transfer, and I'm going to repeat this because it's, we have tech transfer in every single document of the UN for the last 30 years and nothing has happened, because it's always on mutually agreed term and voluntary. But if we talk about facilitation and affordable access to relevant technology, then maybe we can start having a discussion. And this is something that we're going to have in this plan, and we're going to want to start documenting which are the technology, who owns these technology, bring the actors to the table, and start having a discussion. Over.
Thank you, Chantaline. I think also for raising this issue of the kind of positive incentives and the carrot. Erika.
Thank you, Christophe. I will pick up from some of the speakers left. Well, I like the idea of connecting the dots, because it refers back to national adaptation frameworks, which means for us, a developing country with such a clean energy matrix in Brazil, that our domestic efforts should also be taken into account when you talk about border measures. That's the effective way of cooperating. That sets the international scene for more cooperation for a country like Brazil and many others in the same situation. So, and cooperation leads implies, in our case, mutual recognition, for example. It's essential that any border mechanism recognizes what has been done in domestic level. And this has been ignored in many of the mechanisms, right? But as Andre Marco correctly said, and also Chantaline, this hinges on competitiveness, because the moment you recognize that a product or the embedded emissions in a product are far less than your own domestic product, then you have a different market conditions for the imported good and service. And what we see right now is a kind, in fact, because they do not recognize domestic efforts, because they set one single price for carbon, in whatever conditions the carbon is emitted, it's called protectionism, it's called unilateralism, and we don't see the multilateral trading framework to work on to our benefit, because the evolution of the disputes at the WTO in Article 20 of the GATT and letter G, they show us that in even the latest case, it shows that evolution is towards recognition of the legitimacy of such unilateral measures, the only point being that, as applied, the way these measures are applied could be discriminatory in some cases. So, but they don't tackle the core of the issue for us, developing countries, which is cooperation, mutual recognition, and taking into account our national specificities. And one last point that has not been raised, but we are also very worried about certification of carbon credits and the lack of interoperability among the systems. There have been some efforts in the WTO into interoperability of the systems, but whenever you talk about that to major countries, even in the administration before the current and the Biden administration, they said they didn't want any kind of transparency mechanism, not even transparency mechanism, not to mention interoperability proposal, either in the Trade and Environment Committee or any other committee at WTO. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Erika, and I think thank you also for raising some of the this issue of equivalences, and because one question that came to my mind while listening all these presentations, we're looking at where are the different avenues where this discussion can take place, but then the next question is, where do we want this discussion to lead to? What type of cooperation are we thinking about? What should be the landing zone or the outcome of this discussion? So I think thank you for pointing to some of these issues, and we can come back maybe in the discussion. But I see Christina first, and I don't know if you want to say something afterwards.
I had the chance to respond to some of the.
I was.
Go ahead, Christina. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was to say something along the lines of what the ambassadors mentioned. I think the discussion that we're having right now is really just the beginning of something that will have a long-term trajectory. We all know that NDCs, well, they were due in February this year. Hopefully there will be more coming prior to the COP. But they will have to be communicated every 5 years. And every 5 years, they will have to become more demanding. Domestic climate policies will have to become more demanding, which means that perhaps more jurisdictions, more states, more regions will be in a situation similar to the one where we see the EU currently acting, meaning that there will be a need to prevent against carbon leakage, to account for embedded emissions, and maybe to a certain degree protective measures. And we already see several countries outside the EU having enabling provisions for CBAM in their domestic climate legislation. I think Vietnam, South Korea, and even Brazil has an enabling clause for CBAM. So rather than having an escalating situations a couple of years down the road where we have different CBAMs applied against different countries, it is very, very important to discuss here and now and have a continuous discussions of how to de-escalate the risk of the position of CBAM. Through comparable climate policies, it doesn't have to be the same price, it doesn't have to be the same cap, but that comparability that the ambassador just mentioned, I think will be absolutely crucial. To what extent can states recognize climate policy somewhere outside as comparable to their domestic regulatory impositions? So I think this is a discussion that will not go away. It will increase over time. And for that reason, I think today's discussion is absolutely crucial.
Excellent, thanks. So let me now open the floor for comments, questions. I see Ellie. I will take a few. The lady on the back. So Ellie first.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ellie Belton. I work at E3G. We're a climate think tank, so I'm coming at this from a climate perspective. I'm the lonely trade person. I have two questions, if I can be cheeky. I'll be quick. The first is to pick up on something that you were talking about, Andre, relating to the role of the UNFCCC in facilitating international cooperation on carbon leakage. So the idea that the CBAM is a kind of interim solution and where can we go beyond there, and the role of this venue in that space, I think that's really underexplored and something that we want to do more work on. So if we don't get to cover that now, I might pick that up with you afterwards. Second question, which I think is, I'm really keen to hear from Erica and the wider panel on the new forum that Brazil is proposing at COP this year. I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying I personally think it's a brilliant idea and is really central to unpacking some of the tensions that we're seeing. But we have concerns, I think, that there won't be the membership that we need in the forum. And I'm talking about, economies who are proposing CBAMs have concerns that this forum will become another kind of CBAM bashing venue, and that there are already, existing international initiatives trying to operate in this space, and so it becomes a bit of an issue of duplication. And I do think this is different because I think it's really important that we have an inclusive space that's facilitating this open dialogue and rebuilding the trust, which has clearly been broken. But what do people think around these issues and how we can ensure that there is really wide and inclusive cooperation from all economies in this forum? Thank you.
Thank you. Good. I'm going to collect a few and then we'll go back to our. So please take note of the different questions. Yes.
Hello, good morning. Noelia Garcia, Head of Sustainability and Partnerships at ISO International Standards. So of course my question is going to be about international standards. I raised the point yesterday, but I think it's very relevant to the discussion we are having this morning. We have mentioned importance of multilateral agreed approaches, avoid competition, the need for comparability in CBAM. We have today, and we know, a big fragmentation in the area of international standards, but we do have organizations that represent the global international standards system, such as ISO or IEC or ITU, that develop standards according to the WTO TBT principles. So my question is, in this discussion, how do we leverage those tools? How do we leverage those organizations that are today not at the table of that discussion? How do we bring them to the discussions in COP30, UNFCCC, and other forums? And how do we leverage the efforts that are being taking place to harmonize, to create interoperability between these tools, such as the ISO GHG protocol partnership that we just announced a couple of weeks ago? So I'm happy to hear your thoughts here. Thanks.
Thank you. You're next. Yes.
Yes, hi. Rachel Thrasher, Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. This is hugely illuminating, and I just want to say my remarks are largely a result of conversations I've had with many of you in the room the last day or so. So thanks already, and they're just crystallizing as I'm hearing more of this conversation. Something that was said, I believe Christina mentioned the idea of trade as a tool, trade not as an end in itself, but a means to an end. And I think it's so important too that in addition to being a tool for emissions reductions, it's also a tool for adaptation. And I know that conversation happened to some extent yesterday, but I think in that sense, the typical tools that have been put forward have been implemented already in terms of sort of carbon markets, carbon border adjustments, and whatnot are not effective for adaptation purposes. And so I think the tools will be different. I'm curious from the panelists' perspective, what those other kinds of tools, they've seen be effective, or to the extent that they have been. And one tool in particular that Chantal brought up, the technology transfer idea, and I think another issue that's popped up a few different times. So one of the big issues with the idea of technology transfer, and I think one of the reasons it hasn't actually happened, is because it's not well defined in the commitments. And so I'm encouraged by the idea of technology facilitation. I'm encouraged by that as a sort of a new way to think about it, or affordable access to relevant technologies. But I think it's going to be complicated in some of the areas of frontier technology change, in particular where we're talking about the technologies involved in decarbonizing heavy industry. And so I was curious if you could think of any tools, if you knew of any tools that would facilitate that a little bit better. And this goes to maybe a central theme, which is that there's often a conversation about wanting to create a coalition of the willing. And I think that is a way forward in the climate space, but it quickly becomes a coalition of the wealthy and capable. And so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about how to create more capacity building where the fiscal space is not available. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Jody and Bernardo. Okay.
Thanks very much. It's such an excellent panel. It's really a pleasure to listen to all of you. Thank you so much. Quite two specific questions. The first one in relation to the role of the maritime and the aviation industries and the kind of carbon pricing and markets that are being developed there. I was really pleased that you brought that dimension in, because I think it tends to be missing when we're talking about trade and we're focused on territorial emissions. And when I speak to different stakeholders about this, because you've got the financial sector as well, kind of pricing carbon, and you've got a whole different set of dynamics there as well. But I guess it's just to kind of echo the point, when I talk to stakeholders as well, they're kind of, quite concerned about the CBAM and the carbon price that's being imposed there. But they're then also quite aware that you've got these different aspects that are also pricing carbon. So I just tend to think, do we need to think a little bit out of the box here as well? And, perhaps having that kind of greater engagement with the private sector, how they're adapting to these different pressures in terms of the pricing, and maybe coming to, rather than this kind of top-down negotiated approach, actually kind of a bit more kind of private sector working with businesses. So that's my first point. My second point is about the CBAM and Article 6. I'm really pleased you're talking about Article 6, because I'm also struck, people don't tend to pay attention to Article 6 and how it could be used, and how we could actually have more carrots, less of a big stick and more carrots. So I'd just like to push you a little bit more, what more could be done with Article 6? What do you think about the proposal by the Commission to perhaps introduce more flexibilities related to Article 6? Is that good enough, or what more could be done? Thanks.
Excellent. I'm just looking at the time, so I think I'll take Bernardo's question. Is there any other burning question? It's now your last opportunity. No. So
I'll be very brief. Bernardo Aze from ODI Global, and being aware of time, I know Ambassador Patriota said that no political guidance for this intergovernmental forum, but if you would have to advise this forum, what would you say? It's just a simple question on where this forum could go, and based on which principles. So I was curious just on your messaging for this, or would your message would be for this forum? Thanks.
Okay, so we have a bit less than 10 minutes, so I will just give the floor back to our speakers. If you can take 1 minute, you don't have to answer all the questions. Just focus on the ones that you want to address, and start with in the same order as we had.
Thank you. I try to be very brief. Answering the first question, I would refer you to a document that Brazil has circulated ahead of the Committee on Trade and Environment in next November. It's RD/CTE/301, where you have the structure of the mechanism we are thinking about. So I have a copy here if you want to have access directly to it. It will be the mechanism will be structured around the panel of experts, which will pose the questions to technical working groups. And then you have senior official meetings. So that's the kind of roughly the composition of the mechanism. So, and as I mentioned in the opening remarks, we are going from negotiations to concrete practical actions. So as recommendation on how we can have affordable access to affordable technologies, how this mechanism of financing could be implemented. These are the questions that we hope the panel of experts will pose to the working groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Chantaline?
Yeah, maybe I'll take two. My ISO colleague, I think one of the things I forgot to mention is, and I'll give a specific example because otherwise so we just launched the UN Global Seaweed Initiative. And one of the things we look at are the standards that exist or don't exist, which is limiting the trade in seaweed, which is a great comparative advantage for developing countries. And yet we can't talk about harmonization because it needs to be contextualized. So how do you scale while you contextualize these standards so you allow for trade? And this is, I think, the key question that we need to address that has not been addressed so far, and it's gonna have to be by sector otherwise. So looking forward to work with you on this. The other one is on the lady, Rachel, I believe, from Boston College University. So yeah, I think for the coalition of I like your expression, coalition of the rich, capable, and the wealthy. Indeed. And one of the things that happened yesterday at UNCTAD was day before, is the COP for the global system of trade preferences, where member states have basically came together and look at how because you're right about the fine point technology at the frontier of innovation, but there's a lot of technology out there available that could be affordable, that could be traded among developing countries, and it doesn't have to be South-South, it could be South-South Trade Corporation. But I really believe this is a venue that can counter that group of wealthy and capable. And there was decision made yesterday, 2 days ago, that there will be some area that related to trade and climate that we'll be looking to, as well as fisheries and SMEs. And my last point to Judy, I do believe that we need to start with the private sector, but when we say private sector, we tend to think of multinational and not the cooperative, the small, medium enterprise, the micro-entrepreneur, those that really are solving these issues on the ground, and we don't connect them to then the decision-making and the national, and that oftentimes it's gonna be FDI. Yeah, it's great. But what about the national companies that have solutions but we don't support? So I really think we need to work on that. And your last question, I refer you to the LDC report or was it Africa report this year? Basically, LDCs will not be able to take advantage of Article 6. It's too complex. So if we want the poor countries to take advantage of those, it needs to be simplified and more work needs to be done.
Thank you. Vice?
Yeah, so a couple of points just on the ISO ITU question. I think, and this actually goes also to Chantaline's point as well about the difficulties in having standards that provide some flexibility as well. And I think a key part of it, and I've heard this over and over again, not only from colleagues working in the climate negotiations, but actually also colleagues from different missions here in Geneva, when they go to ISO meetings, for example, they seldom see developing country colleagues there. Now, we know that you have standard-setting organizations from different developing country governments attending, and some of them are active, but in large part what I have heard is that they are not that active. And I think that the question here is, how do you, one, build capacity so that they become more participatory and they know they know what they need to put forward so that it reflects also their circumstances. And second, I think there also needs to be a greater focus, not only by ISO or other organizations, but maybe also UNCTAD, for example, to support the kind of integrated approach at the national level, where the standard-setting organizations talk to their environment ministry, talk to their trade ministry, so that they can actually figure out what they can put forward, right? And that does not happen, and we know that does not happen because I've talked, for example, to my colleagues in the Philippines Trade Ministry in the Bureau of Product Standards, and they said, well, actually, we don't talk to the climate folks at all, right? So that's one thing. Second one, I wanted to point as well to, like Chantaline, to the technology facilitation, technology transfer issue. One is that, and I've said this in other presentations, one is that developing countries by and large know what they want and what they need in terms of climate-related technologies. Hundreds of technology assessment, technology needs assessments have already been done by them over the past 20, 25 years. They've put forward technology proposals as well, not only in the UNFCCC context, but also in other areas. And the funding has not been there. So I think in addition to the facilitation part, there also needs to be a strong push to facilitate the coalition of the wealthy and capable to actually live up to the commitments that they had to provide technology transfer and support technology transfer. I mean, the proposals are there, they're just waiting to be funded. The mechanisms are there through which funding can flow. The institutional arrangements are there in the GCF, in the Adaptation Fund, in the Loss and Damage Fund, in the GEF, through which donors can actually facilitate technology transfer according to the commitments that they have. But they are not doing that. So I think that is one key aspect. We can talk about tech transfer and why it's not working, but it's not working by and large because those that have committed to it have not actually implemented those. So that is an implementation aspect of this that we need to focus on. Thanks.
Thank you. Andre?
Well, look, I moved from Geneva to Brussels, and I was very frustrated, continue to be frustrated. Very different cities. I mean, who are the powers in Brussels? The power in Brussels, the Eurofair, STEM Bureau, Fuels Europe, the European aluminum. These are the influencers and the powers. What they're interested in, competitiveness. That's all it is. I mean, to be blunt about it. So we're having a very different conversation, and that needs to be recognized in how things are being dealt with. Now, you talk about how do you bring all these cats together. Listen, many years ago, through a long process, it was the voluntary market was in crisis. Together with the climate group, AIDA kind of got everybody that was in the voluntary market, tried to come up with what is today Vera. It's not necessarily free of problems, but there are processes. If there's a willingness to do it, there are processes to bring people together in the same room and get it over and try to work. But I want to especially refer to this forum that Brazil is launching. Now, we all know God is Brazilian, but seriously, my former boss, Maurice Strong, loved Brazil, and I inherited that love. Now, I think that anything that Brazil starts, we take seriously. And this is not a minor initiative. I think that if Brazil has put its face on it, we trust that it will be an important one and the one that is very welcome and very timely. The question that I had to your colleagues in Brasilia when they talked to me about this was a very simple one. Do you guys have the mandate and the resources to do this? Why? Because it takes time and resources and effort and persistence. And I will refer you to one simple example. A simple example is the joint crediting mechanism that Japan has done. Now, they took 10 years, and they've been persistent, and they put resources, and they've been persistent, and they put resources, and they have one. But it takes effort, and it takes serious commitment. And that is the only kind of question that we don't know the answer to. But other than that, we are really excited about this initiative, and we really hope it works well.
Thank you. Christina, your concluding thoughts.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on this question or comment on technology transfer, because it was mentioned in the context of adaptation. And of course, there we do have known technology transfer needs, but there is also a need for innovation and upscaling, which needs to be explored. And that, by the way, also applies to international shipping and aviation-based emissions, which someone else addressed as well, where we meet a hard-to-abate sector where technological innovation is absolutely crucial in order to get those emissions down. And then there's another issue which we haven't discussed at all, and that is scaling up carbon dioxide removals, right? We do know that this needs to be part of the picture. It's necessary to get down to net zero and even below net zero. And carbon dioxide removal, for example, through ducts or BECCS, is something where we don't have the technology at scale at all, where technology transfer will be absolutely crucial, as well as innovation, of course, in the first place. And here we run into questions about how, for example, the TBT agreement, technical barriers to trade, or the SCM agreement, subsidies and countervailing measures under the WTO, can be hopefully helpful instruments mobilizing and incentivizing this technology transfer rather than maybe an obstacle to it. But I think there is still a lot of work to be done to make sure that technology transfer happens and that the finances are there. I completely agree with Vincent, but also that the regulatory framework around it is supportive and not an obstacle.
Thank you. Yasmin?
Thank you. I want to comment very quickly on three things that has been said. I have to say I like the idea of how this was put, of facilitating international cooperation on carbon leakage, because we often forget that this was one of the main reasons why we have CBAM, we have border carbon adjustments. It was the underlying, or one of the underlying problems that this is meant to deal with. So this puts it in a way where we need to enhance international cooperation on the problem, rather than just point fingers at some of the policies or that are being taken. And the second thing that I wanted to comment on is the fact that, or like a professor mentioned, trade is a means to an end, and also Rachel commented on. And this has been, I just want to say that this is exactly what we heard in Philippines from experts in the Philippines, that trade needs to be a means rather than an end in trade and climate discussions. And this links also to this idea where competitiveness leads sometimes to turning the trade and climate discussion into a tense discussion. And the idea is that what we're trying to do at the national level is to take the angle of trade in climate action beyond the competitiveness. The competitiveness objective is there. Of course, all countries want to trade and want to trade more, but it cannot be the only dimension of looking at trade and climate nexus. It needs to be there, but countries need to also identify how their trade policies can support the broader goals, the climate action goal and their sustainable development goal. And the range of tools are many, Rachel, from market mechanisms to standards to public procurement and other, and it's only in the national context that you can identify the best policy tool based on the country circumstances that can tick the boxes for the different long-term goals. My final point for the UNFCCC, my recommendation is please be as inclusive as possible, and I'm sure that this is already one of the objectives that Brazil are seeking. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I think Erika wanted to add a last thing, so I'll give her that opportunity, and then we'll close.
I will try to be very brief. I will give you the state of the art on technology transfer. It happened 10 hours ago at UNCTAD when Brazil was about to ask a vote on the paragraph on technology, on transfer of technology, because one, fragmentation of the G77. We had one support from G77 when we were about to ask for the deletion on mutually agreed terms, because we know that if you qualify transfer of technology as it was written in TRIPS agreement and ASEM and many other agreements with mutually agreed terms, it means there's no transfer. There's no transfers, and we could convince only one member within G77 out of 134 members that this qualification would render void the transfer of technology. So, and then when we had a hard time, it took us more than 5 hours to have the final say of developed countries, when we added, okay, transfer of technology on mutually agreed terms and in accordance with international agreements. They said, we cannot go with this language. We disassociate from this paragraph because we don't know this language. Because for us, and it has been like 5 years, the term is transfer of technology on mutually agreed terms. Otherwise, we can't accept any reference to transfer. So this is the state of the art by many countries. I believe that within JUSCANS, maybe only Switzerland, the host country, did not disassociate itself from this paragraph. So this is where we are in terms of technology and access to it.
Thank you, Erika. So I think this takes us to the end of the session. A really interesting discussion. Thank you all for participating. I'm not trying to summarize or synthesize the discussions. It was really good. We'll have 2 thematic sessions starting at 11, one on critical raw material, which is going to take place in the other building, and one on trade-related measures with climate objectives, which will take place in this room. So thank you, everybody, and please join me in congratulating our speakers for this.